Think about this for a moment. For the first 137 years of its existence, the United States of America, the nation that would eventually become the world's largest economy, operated without a permanent central bank. No Federal Reserve, no singular authority controlling the money supply, no lender of last resort standing behind the entire financial system ready to catch it when it fell. And yet, during that same stretch of time, America went from a fragile collection of war-torn colonies drowning in debt to the most powerful industrial force on Earth. So, how did it work? How did the economy survive without the institution we now consider absolutely essential to modern finance? The answer is far stranger, far messier, and far more revealing than most people realize. Because America didn't simply coast through those years on luck and hard work. It lurched from crisis to crisis, from boom to bust, from stability to absolute chaos over and over again. The country experimented with central banks, killed them, tried something different, watched it collapse, and then tried again. Along the way, titans of industry, street-level conmen, furious presidents, secretive bankers, and entire communities of ordinary people were swept up in a financial drama that shaped not just the American economy, but the global order we live in today. And the story of how America finally got its central bank, the Federal Reserve, in 1913 is one of the most extraordinary, conspiratorial, and consequential episodes in the history of money itself. Let me take you back to the very beginning, to a moment when the United States didn't even have a functioning currency, let alone a central bank. When the American colonies declared independence from Britain in 1776, they faced a problem that was arguably more dangerous than the British Army itself, and that was money. The Continental Congress needed to finance a revolution, but it had no power to tax. It had no gold reserves. It had no financial infrastructure whatsoever. So, Congress did what desperate governments have done throughout history. It printed money. Between 1775 and 1779, Congress authorized roughly $241.5 million in paper notes called Continentals. These were backed by nothing more than a vague promise that the new nation would someday be able to redeem them. And at first, people accepted them. But as the war dragged on and Congress kept printing more and more, the currency began to collapse. By 1780, a continental dollar was worth less than a penny compared to its original face value. The phrase "not worth a continental" became a popular expression for anything completely worthless. Soldiers who had fought and bled for independence were being paid in money that couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Farmers refused to sell their goods for the rapidly devaluing paper. Entire communities reverted to barter. This was the financial environment into which the United States was born. A nation whose first experience with government-issued money was an unmitigated disaster, and it left scars on the American psyche that would influence every debate about banking and currency for the next century and beyond. Americans were terrified of centralized monetary power, and rightfully so. They had watched their government destroy the value of their savings with the printing press. That fear would become one of the most powerful political forces in American history. But there was one man who believed that the only way to save this fragile new nation was to build a financial system from scratch. That man was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was not born into American aristocracy. He was an immigrant, an orphan from the Caribbean island of Nevis, who had clawed his way into the inner circle of the revolution through sheer brilliance and relentless ambition. When George Washington appointed him the first Secretary of the Treasury in 1789, Hamilton inherited a catastrophe. The federal government owed roughly $54 million in war debts. The individual states owed another $25 million. The currency was in shambles. Foreign creditors had little faith that this new experiment in democracy would survive long enough to repay what it owed. Hamilton's solution was audacious and deeply controversial. He proposed that the federal government assume all of the state war debts, consolidate them into a single national debt, and then create a national bank to manage it. This institution would stabilize the currency, collect taxes, make loans to the government, and serve as a repository for federal funds. He modeled his vision on the Bank of England, the institution that had helped transform Britain from a second-rate European power into a global empire. To Hamilton, a national bank was not just a financial tool. It was a political machine of the greatest importance to the state, as he put it. It would tie the wealthiest citizens and most powerful merchants to the success of the new government. Because if the nation failed, their investments in the bank would be worthless. It was genius, but it was also deeply threatening to a large number of Americans. The opposition was led by two of the most influential men in the country, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Jefferson, the great champion of agrarian democracy, saw Hamilton's bank as a Trojan horse for northern financial elites. He believed it would create a monopoly that favored creditors, merchants, and bankers over the farmers and planters who formed the backbone of the American economy. Jefferson also argued that the Constitution gave Congress no authority to create such an institution. If the government could charter a national bank, he reasoned, then there was no limit to what it could do, and the entire concept of a government of limited enumerated powers would be meaningless. Madison agreed, warning that the bank would concentrate wealth and influence in the hands of a privileged few. The debate was so fierce that it cracked open the first major ideological fault line in American politics. Hamilton's supporters, the Federalists, believed in a strong central government with an active role in the economy. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans believed in states' rights, limited government, and deep suspicion of concentrated financial power. This was not just an argument about banking. It was a battle over the soul of the new nation. In the end, Hamilton won. He convinced President Washington that the Constitution's necessary and proper clause gave Congress the implied authority to create a national bank. Washington signed the bill on February 25, 1791, and the first bank of the United States opened its doors in Philadelphia later that year with a capitalization of $10 million, an astronomical sum at the time that made it the largest corporation of any kind in the entire country. The federal government owned 20% of the stock. Private investors owned the rest, including a significant number of foreign shareholders, a fact that made many Americans deeply uncomfortable. And for 20 years, the first bank did exactly what Hamilton had promised. It stabilized the currency. It managed the government's finances. It extended credit to businesses and helped facilitate interstate commerce. It even acted as a check on state-chartered banks by presenting their notes for redemption in gold and silver, which forced them to maintain adequate reserves and prevented them from printing reckless amounts of worthless paper. The economy grew steadily. Foreign creditors regained confidence in the young republic. The national debt was brought under control. By almost any objective measure, the first bank was a success. But politics is not governed by objective measures. By 1811, when the bank's 20-year charter came up for renewal, the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Hamilton was dead, killed in a duel with Aaron Burr in 1804. Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party was now firmly in power. The number of state-chartered banks had exploded, and those banks deeply resented the first bank's regulatory authority and its competitive advantage. Foreign ownership of the bank's stock, which had grown to roughly 70%, became a potent political weapon. Opponents argued that British and Dutch investors were profiting from American commerce at the expense of American citizens. When the renewal vote came before Congress, it failed by a single vote in the Senate. The first bank of the United States quietly closed its doors, and for the first time, America had to figure out what an economy without any national banking institution looked like. The answer came quickly, and it was ugly. Without the first bank acting as a disciplining force on state banks, the number of these institutions exploded. In 1811, there were roughly 88 state-chartered banks in the country. By 1816, there were over 246. Many of these banks were poorly capitalized and loosely regulated. They printed enormous quantities of their own banknotes, most of which traded at varying discounts depending on how far you were from the issuing bank and how much faith the market had in its ability to redeem those notes for gold or silver on demand. The result was monetary chaos. A dollar bill issued by a bank in Boston might be worth 90 cents in New York and only 60 cents in Ohio. Merchants needed to carry counterfeit detectors and discount tables just to conduct basic business. Fraud was rampant. Some estimates suggest that roughly a third of all paper currency in circulation during the worst periods was counterfeit. And then came the War of 1812. The federal government needed to borrow heavily to finance the conflict with Britain. But without a national bank to coordinate the effort, the Treasury struggled to raise funds. The government resorted to issuing bonds at steep discounts and borrowing from state banks at punishing interest rates. By the end of the war, the Treasury was nearly bankrupt and the financial system was in disarray. The experience made one thing painfully clear. Whatever philosophical objections people had to a national bank, the practical reality of fighting a major war without one was nearly catastrophic. And so in 1816, just 5 years after letting the first bank expire, Congress chartered the Second Bank of the United States with a capitalization of $35 million in a 20-year charter. It was headquartered in Philadelphia, and its structure was similar to its predecessor. The federal government owned 20% of the stock, appointed a fifth of the directors, and deposited its funds in the bank. The second bank got off to a terrible start. Its early management was incompetent and corrupt. Large non-performing loans were made to insiders and political allies. The bank contributed to a speculative land boom and then a devastating bust known as the Panic of 1819, the first major financial crisis in American history. Banks across the country collapsed. Foreclosures swept through farming communities. Unemployment soared. The public blamed the second bank, and with good reason. But then something changed. In 1823, a brilliant and forceful financier named Nicholas Biddle took over as the bank's president. Biddle was everything his predecessors were not: disciplined, visionary, and deeply knowledgeable about monetary policy. Under his leadership, the second bank transformed into something that functioned remarkably like a modern central bank. Biddle managed the money supply by expanding and contracting credit. He maintained a uniform national currency by accepting the notes of state banks at par and presenting them for redemption when they became too numerous. He provided the government with efficient fiscal services and even helped eliminate the national debt entirely by 1835. The only time in American history that has happened. By the late 1820s, the second bank was one of the most powerful financial institutions on earth. Its paper notes as good as gold anywhere in the country. Trade was flourishing from Boston to the expanding western frontier. State banks and businesses had benefited from tens of millions in loans. The economy was humming, and then Andrew Jackson arrived. Jackson was elected president in 1828 as the champion of the common man, a frontier war hero who despised the Eastern financial establishment with every fiber of his being. He had been personally burned by financial speculation early in his career, and he carried a deep, almost visceral distrust of banks, paper money, and any institution that concentrated economic power in the hands of what he considered a privileged elite. To Jackson, the second bank was a monster, a hydra of corruption that enriched wealthy stockholders and foreign investors while oppressing ordinary farmers, laborers, and small business owners. He saw Biddle as a dangerous aristocrat wielding unaccountable power over the nation's finances. The fact that the bank had been performing well was irrelevant to Jackson. The principle was what mattered, and the principle was simple. No private institution should have that much control over the economic life of a free people. The battle between Jackson and Biddle became one of the most dramatic political confrontations in American history. In 1832, Jackson's opponents in Congress, led by Senator Henry Clay and Senator Daniel Webster, pushed through a bill to renew the bank's charter 4 years early, betting that Jackson would not dare veto such a popular measure in an election year. They were wrong. Jackson vetoed the Recharter Bill with one of the most powerful and emotionally charged presidential messages ever delivered. He declared the bank unauthorized by the Constitution, subversive to the rights of states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. He even directly contradicted the Supreme Court's ruling in McCulloch versus Maryland, which had affirmed the bank's constitutionality, asserting that as president, he had the right to judge the Constitution for himself. The veto was unprecedented in its scope, in its rhetoric. Jackson then made the fate of the bank the central issue of the 1832 presidential election, framing the contest as a war between the people and the money power. He won in a landslide. Interpreting his victory as a mandate from the American people, Jackson went further. He ordered all federal deposits withdrawn from the second bank and redistributed to dozens of state-chartered institutions that his critics derisively called pet banks. Biddle retaliated by dramatically restricting the bank's loans, deliberately triggering a credit crunch that he hoped would cause enough economic pain to force Congress to override Jackson's veto. It was a breathtakingly reckless gambit, and it backfired. Instead of turning the public against Jackson, Biddle's financial warfare only confirmed Jackson's warnings about the bank's dangerous power. A single unelected banker had just deliberately plunged the country into economic distress to protect his institution. When the second bank's charter expired in 1836, it was not renewed. America had killed its second central bank, and this time there would not be another one for 77 years. What followed was one of the strangest and most turbulent periods in American financial history. A period that would test whether a modern economy could actually function without a central authority managing its money. The era from 1837 to 1863 is commonly known as the free banking era, and the name itself tells you something about the philosophy behind it. In many states during this period, virtually anyone who could raise a modest amount of capital and meet some basic registration requirements could open a bank. There was no federal regulation of banking at all. Each state set its own rules, or in some cases, barely any rules at all. And every one of these banks could issue its own paper currency, its own banknotes backed by whatever assets the bank held, typically state bonds, mortgages, or gold and silver coin. The result was an explosion of financial creativity, financial chaos, and occasionally financial fraud on a spectacular scale. At any given time during this period, there were hundreds, sometimes thousands of different banknotes circulating across the country, each with its own design, its own denomination, and its own level of trustworthiness. A traveler moving from New York to Illinois might encounter dozens of different currencies, each trading at a different discount or premium depending on the reputation of the issuing bank and the distance from its headquarters. Merchants and traders relied on published guides called banknote reporters to keep track of which notes were worth what. And even with those guides, the system was a nightmare of confusion, friction, and risk. And then there were the wildcat banks, the most infamous products of this laissez-faire approach to finance. The term allegedly came from the practice of setting up banks in remote, inaccessible locations where the wildcats roamed to make it as difficult as possible for note holders to travel to the bank and demand redemption of their paper in gold or silver. Michigan's experience in 1837 and 1838 became the most notorious example. The state had passed one of the earliest free banking laws, and within months dozens of new banks appeared. Some were legitimate, many were not. State commissioners were supposed to inspect the banks and verify their gold and silver reserves. but the commissioners were overwhelmed and underfunded. Stories circulated of banks passing the same chest of coins from one institution to another, staying just ahead of the inspectors, creating the illusion that every bank had adequate reserves when in reality none of them did. Some banks existed only on paper with no physical office, no employees, and no intention of ever redeeming the notes they printed. They would flood the market with their currency, wait for it to circulate, and then vanish. The note holders were left with scraps of worthless paper. Now, it is important to say that the free banking era was not entirely the disaster that this description might suggest. More recent scholarship has shown that the wildcat problem was concentrated in a relatively small number of states, with particularly weak regulation like Michigan, and that many free banks, especially in states like New York, operated reasonably well. The overall failure rate was high. Perhaps 50 to 60% of all free banks eventually closed, but many of those closures were orderly, with note holders recovering most or all of their money. The system was messy, but it was not uniformly catastrophic. However, the periodic panics were very real and very devastating. America experienced major financial crises in 1819, 37, 1857, 1873, 1893 and 1907. Each of these panics followed a broadly similar pattern. A period of economic expansion fueled by easy credit and speculation would be followed by a sudden loss of confidence, a rush to withdraw deposits and redeem banknotes, a cascade of bank failures, a contraction of credit, and a deep economic downturn that threw millions of people out of work and destroyed fortunes large and small. And without a central bank to act as a lender of last resort to inject liquidity into the system when confidence evaporated, there was no institutional mechanism to stop the dominoes from falling. The system relied on the collective action of individual banks, clearing house associations, and occasionally the intervention of enormously wealthy private citizens to stem the bleeding. It was in essence an economy held together by duct tape and prayer during its worst moments. The Civil War brought another radical transformation to the American financial system. In 1861, the Union government faced the same problem that the Continental Congress had faced during the Revolution. It needed to finance a massive war and had no easy way to do it. Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase devised a solution that would reshape American banking for the next 50 years. First, Congress authorized the issuance of roughly $450 million in paper currency known as greenbacks, so-called because of the green ink used on their reverse side. These were the first truly national paper currency, legal tender for all debts, public and private, but notably not backed by gold or silver. They were backed by nothing more than the full faith and credit of the United States government, which at the time was fighting a war that it was not guaranteed to win. Inflation followed just as it had during the Revolution, though not as dramatically. At their low point, greenbacks traded at roughly 35 cents on the dollar compared to gold. But the more lasting innovation came with the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864. These laws created a system of nationally chartered banks that could issue a new uniform national currency, but only if they first purchased United States government bonds to back their notes. This was brilliant from the government's perspective. It created an enormous captive market for war bonds, ensuring that the government could continue to borrow at favorable rates. It also created a more uniform currency, since all national banknotes looked the same and were backed by the same collateral government debt. And to make sure the old state banknotes would disappear, Congress imposed a punishing 10% tax on any banknotes issued by state-chartered banks, effectively driving them out of the currency issuing business. The national banking system was a vast improvement over the chaos of the free banking era. But it was still not a central bank. There was no central authority managing the money supply, no lender of last resort, no mechanism to provide emergency liquidity during crisis. The system was rigid and inflexible. The supply of national banknotes was tied directly to the supply of government bonds, which meant that the currency could not expand or contract with the needs of the economy. Every autumn, when farmers needed credit to move their crops to market, the demand for money surged and interest rates spiked painfully. Every spring, when the crop moving season ended, the excess currency flowed back into New York banks, fueling Wall Street speculation. This seasonal seesawing created chronic instability, and it was particularly hard on farmers in the South and West, who felt with considerable justification that the entire financial system was designed to benefit the bankers and industrialists of the Northeast at their expense. And so the panics continued 1873, 1884, 1890, 1893. Each one reinforced the same brutal lesson. Without a central bank, the American economy was extraordinarily vulnerable to financial shocks. When confidence evaporated, the system had no shock absorber. Banks would suspend cash payments, locking depositors out of their own money. Businesses would fail by the thousands. Unemployment would spike. Communities would be devastated. And then eventually the storm would pass. Confidence would return and the cycle would begin again. It was a pattern of extraordinary dynamism and extraordinary fragility, and it could not last forever. The crisis that finally broke the camel's back came in October of 1907. The Panic of 1907 was not the worst financial crisis in American history. The depressions of 1873 and 1893 were arguably more severe and more prolonged. But the Panic of 1907 had something the earlier crises did not. It had a singular dramatic human element that made the absurdity and the danger of America's financial system impossible to ignore. The panic was triggered by a spectacularly failed attempt to corner the stock of the United Copper Company. A speculator named Augustus Heinze and his associate Charles Morse had been using a network of banks and trust companies to finance their scheme. When the corner collapsed, depositors who had money in banks associated with Heinze and Morse panicked and began withdrawing their funds. The panic spread rapidly from these initial institutions to the broader network of trust companies in New York City. Trust companies were a particular vulnerability in the system. They competed with national banks for deposits, but operated under much lighter regulation. They held smaller reserves and were not members of the New York Clearing House, the private institution that coordinated mutual support among the city's major banks. When the Clearing House denied emergency assistance to the Knickerbocker Trust Company, the third largest trust in New York, a full-scale run ensued. Depositors formed long lines outside the building, desperately trying to withdraw their savings before the money ran out. On October 22, 1907, the Knickerbocker suspended operations entirely, locking thousands of people out of their money. The panic threatened to engulf the entire financial system, and there was no government institution with the authority or the resources to stop it. And so the task of saving the American economy fell to one man, a 70-year-old financier with a fierce gaze and an enormous nose, the most powerful private banker in the world, John Pierpont Morgan. When the chaos began, Morgan was out of town at a church convention in Richmond, Virginia. He rushed back to New York and turned his private library on Madison Avenue into a command center. Over the next 3 weeks, Morgan essentially functioned as a one-man central bank. He summoned the presidents of the city's major banks and trust companies to his library, examined their books, decided which institutions were solvent and which were not, and organized emergency pools of money to keep the viable ones afloat. He pledged large sums of his own money. He convinced other wealthy bankers to do the same. He persuaded the Secretary of the Treasury to deposit $25 million of government funds in New York banks. He even orchestrated an emergency takeover of a failing brokerage firm to prevent a total collapse of the stock market, a deal that required the approval of President Theodore Roosevelt, a man who had built his career fighting the power of men like Morgan. On one of the most dramatic nights, Morgan literally locked the presidents of the trust companies in his library and refused to let them leave until they pledged $25 million to rescue the weakest institutions among them. The last holdout signed at 4:45 in the morning. Morgan's intervention worked. The panic subsided. The financial system survived, but the episode exposed an almost unbelievable truth about the most powerful economy on Earth. The entire American financial system rested not on law, not on institutions, not on public authority, but on the willingness and ability of a single elderly man to open his checkbook and strong-arm his peers into cooperation. What would happen, people began to ask, when there was no J.P. Morgan? What would happen when the next crisis struck and no private citizen was rich enough or powerful enough to stop the bleeding? The answer was obvious. The system needed to change. The panic of 1907 galvanized Congress in a way that previous crises had not. In 1908, Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, one of the most powerful Republicans in the country and a close ally of Wall Street's biggest players, sponsored legislation creating the National Monetary Commission to study the nation's banking problems and recommend solutions. Aldrich was a complex and controversial figure. President Theodore Roosevelt called him the kingpin of the Republicans. Journalists derisively called him the boss of the United States. His daughter was married to John D. Rockefeller Jr., a connection that made many Americans deeply suspicious of his motives. Over the next 2 years, Aldrich traveled extensively in Europe, studying the central banking systems of England, France, and Germany. He arrived in Europe opposed to the idea of a central bank, but the German system in particular impressed him profoundly, and he returned to the United States convinced that America needed something similar. But Aldrich had a problem. He knew that the American public was deeply hostile to the idea of a central bank. 2 previous attempts had ended in political destruction. The populist fear of concentrated financial power, the same fear that had animated Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and millions of ordinary Americans for over a century, was still very much alive. Any plan that appeared to be designed by and for Wall Street bankers would be dead on arrival. And so Aldrich did something extraordinary. In November of 1910, he organized one of the most secretive meetings in American financial history. A gathering that would remain hidden from the public for over 20 years. On the night of November 22nd, 1910, a group of men boarded a private railroad car at a train terminal in Hoboken, New Jersey. They had been instructed to arrive separately, to use only their first names, and to avoid being seen together. One of them even carried a borrowed shotgun as a prop. The cover story was that they were heading on a duck hunting trip to Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. In reality, they were heading to the most exclusive private club in America, a place owned by the likes of J.P. Morgan, William Vanderbilt, and other titans of the Gilded Age, to draft a plan that would reshape the American financial system forever. The group included Aldrich himself, his private secretary Arthur Shelton, Henry Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan and Company A. Piat Andrew, who had been serving as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, the president of National City Bank, one of the largest banks in the country and closely associated with the Rockefeller interests, and Paul Warburg, a German-born banker and partner at the powerful investment bank, Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Warburg was arguably the most important figure at the table. He had studied European central banking systems extensively and had been writing and speaking publicly for years about the need for a similar institution in the United States. He would do most of the actual drafting of the plan. For roughly 10 days, these 6 men worked in seclusion at the Jackal Island Club, hammering out the details of what would become known as the Aldrich Plan. Their proposal called for the creation of a single institution called the National Reserve Association with 15 regional branches controlled by boards of directors elected by member banks. It would hold member banks' reserves, issue a new elastic currency, that could expand and contract with the needs of the economy, discount commercial paper, clear checks, and serve as a lender of last resort during financial emergencies. It was in everything but name a central bank. The secrecy was intentional and it was total. Aldrich knew that if the public discovered that the plan for a new national banking system had been written in secret by a group of the most powerful bankers in the country on an island owned by the richest men in America, the political backlash would destroy the proposal before it could even be debated. The participants denied the meeting had ever taken place for over 2 decades, only confirming it in the 1930s. Frank Vanderlip later wrote in his autobiography that despite his general belief in transparency for corporate affairs, on this occasion he was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. When Aldrich presented his plan to the National Monetary Commission in January of 1911, it was met with immediate and fierce opposition, not because of its substance, which many financial experts considered sound, but because of its author. Aldrich was so closely identified with Wall Street and the Republican establishment that Democrats and populists in the South and West rejected the plan on principle. They saw it as exactly what Jackson had warned about, a new money power designed to serve the interests of a privileged few. The plan stalled in Congress. But then the political landscape shifted in a way no one expected. The election of 1912 brought Democrat Woodrow Wilson to the White House and gave Democrats control of both chambers of Congress for the first time in years. Wilson was committed to banking reform, but he was also determined to distinguish his plan from the Aldrich proposal, even though, as many participants later acknowledged, the two were fundamentally similar. The key differences were political rather than structural. Wilson insisted that the governing board of the new institution be appointed by the president rather than elected by the banks, ensuring at least nominal public accountability. He also embraced a decentralized structure of 12 regional reserve banks rather than a single institution, a concession to the enduring American fear of concentrated power. The resulting legislation, the Federal Reserve Act, was drafted primarily by Virginia Representative Carter Glass and his economic advisor H. Parker Willis. It was hotly debated, fiercely opposed by various factions on both sides, and repeatedly amended. Some Democrats wanted the government to own and control the entire system. Some Republicans wanted the banks to control it. Populists worried about Wall Street's influence. Bankers worried about government interference. The final bill was a classic American compromise, a decentralized central bank that attempted to balance all of these competing interests. It passed the House by a vote of 298 to 60 on December 22, 1913, and the Senate the following day by a vote of 43 to 25, though nearly 30 senators had already left for Christmas vacation by the time the final vote was held. President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law on December 23, 1913. He reportedly said he felt grateful for having had a part in completing a work of lasting benefit for the country. The new Federal Reserve System would not begin operating until November of 1914, but its creation marked the end of a 137-year experiment in which the world's most dynamic economy had tried to function without a permanent central authority managing its money. Now, what does all of this mean? Why does this story matter beyond the history books? It matters because the creation of the Federal Reserve was not simply a technical adjustment to the financial system. It was the culmination of one of the longest and most bitter ideological struggles in American history. A fight between those who believed that economic stability required centralized authority and those who believed that centralized authority was the greatest threat to economic freedom. Both sides had compelling arguments. Both sides had powerful evidence to support their positions. The first and second banks of the United States had demonstrated that a national bank could bring real stability and order to the financial system. But they had also demonstrated that such institutions could become vehicles for corruption, political favoritism, and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of an unaccountable elite. The free banking era and the national banking system had demonstrated that decentralized, market-driven banking could foster extraordinary innovation and economic growth. But they had also demonstrated that without a central authority to coordinate the system and provide emergency liquidity, the economy was horribly vulnerable to panics, bank runs, and devastating depressions. The Federal Reserve was born as a compromise between these two visions, and in many ways it still is. Its decentralized structure, with 12 regional banks answering to a central board in Washington, reflects the enduring American anxiety about concentrated power. Its mandate to promote maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates reflects the lessons learned from over a century of booms and busts. And the perpetual political debate over whether the Fed has too much power or too little, whether it serves the interests of Wall Street or Main Street, whether it should be audited, reformed, or abolished entirely, that debate is a direct descendant of the arguments between Hamilton and Jefferson, between Biddle and Jackson, between the bankers on Jekyll Island and the populists who never trusted them. There's one more dimension to this story that deserves attention. It is often presented as though the period before the Federal Reserve was simply a time of chaos and failure. A dark age that ended when enlightened reformers finally created a proper central bank. But that framing misses something important. During those 137 years without a permanent central bank, the United States experienced the most extraordinary period of economic growth in human history up to that point. The country went from a coastal agricultural nation of 4 million people to an industrial colossus of 92 million, the world's largest producer of steel, oil, and manufactured goods with a GDP that surpassed that of every European power. The railroad networks that stitched the continent together, the factories that produced goods at unprecedented scale, the innovations that electrified cities and connected them by telephone. All of this happened without a Federal Reserve. It happened despite the panics, despite the bank failures, despite the chaotic currency systems and the periodic economic catastrophes. This is not an argument that the Federal Reserve was unnecessary. Far from it. The human cost of those panics was immense. Millions of families lost their savings. Entire communities were destroyed. The boom and bust cycle inflicted suffering that was disproportionately borne by those who could least afford it. The farmers, the laborers, the small business owners who had no connections to Wall Street and no private banker to bail them out when the system collapsed. The Federal Reserve, whatever its flaws, was designed to mitigate that suffering, to smooth out the sharp edges of the business cycle and prevent the periodic financial earthquakes that had rattled the nation for over a century. But the pre-Fed era also demonstrates something profound about the resilience and adaptability of economic systems. In the absence of a central authority, Americans developed an extraordinary range of informal and improvised mechanisms to manage their financial affairs. Clearinghouse associations pooled resources and coordinated emergency lending during crises. Merchants created their own credit networks. Communities developed local currencies and mutual aid societies. Private bankers like Morgan stepped in as lenders of last resort. These improvised solutions were imperfect, often inequitable, and frequently insufficient. But they also represented a remarkable capacity for bottom-up problem-solving that is sometimes lost in the narrative of top-down institutional reform. The deeper truth is that no financial system is perfect. Central banks bring stability, but they also bring new risks, including the risk of inflation, the risk of moral hazard when institutions know they will be rescued, and the risk that monetary policy will be captured by political interests. The absence of a central bank brought freedom and flexibility, but it also brought devastating instability and the constant danger that the entire system could collapse under its own weight. The history of American banking before 1913 is not a simple story of failure followed by success. It is a story of an ongoing, never-resolved tension between the desire for economic freedom and the need for economic security, between the fear of concentrated power and the recognition that some degree of coordination is essential to the functioning of a complex modern economy. And that tension is still with us today, more than a century later. Every debate about whether the Fed should raise or lower interest rates, every argument about bailouts and too big to fail, every call to audit the Fed or rein in its power, every financial crisis that reveals the cracks in the system. All of it echoes back to those foundational questions that Hamilton and Jefferson argued about in George Washington's cabinet, that Jackson and Biddle fought over in the halls of Congress, that 6 men on a private island in Georgia tried to answer in secret in the fall of 1910. The question has never been whether we need a central bank. The question has always been and will always be who controls the money and in whose interest does that power operate. Those are not questions that any single act of legislation can ever fully answer. They are the questions that define the ongoing unfinished project of democratic capitalism itself. If this story changed the way you think about the financial system we all live under, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you want to stay in the loop on stories like these, the ones that connect the hidden machinery of money and power to the world we see every day, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications.